The ordinary white people are not going to be complicit in the system unless they get something out of it. My belief is that payoff was in a certain status, prestige, recognition, ego enhancement that ordinary white people could derive from racism. And so there was a kind of bargain struck.
Many of the European-descended poor whites began to identify themselves, if not directly with the rich whites, certainly with being white. And here you get the emergence of this idea of a white race as a way to distinguish themselves from those dark-skinned people who they associate with perpetual slavery.
Slavery became identified with Africans. Blackness and slavery went together. They gave the white American the idea that Africans were a different kind of people.
There's a racial divide emerging that people begin to see as natural, and that's part of where the idea of race comes from. It's just in the tendency for people to see existing power relationships as having some sort of natural quality to them.
All men are created equal. All men are created equal. It's the lofty and revolutionary ideal at America's core. Yet it was written at a time when some inhabitants were held in bondage, and others were being dispossessed of their lands. How did American society justify unequal treatment based on skin color and national origins? How did it reconcile that contradiction? America created a story of race.
Race was never just a matter of how you look. It's about how people assign meaning to how you look.
We have the idea that it's somewhere written in stone that there are these fundamental differences between human beings. We don't realize that race is an idea that evolves over time, that it has a history, that it is constructed by a society to further certain political and economic goals.
Created over 4 centuries, race has become a powerful and enduring narrative. Moments in America's past reveal how this idea took hold and became the lens through which we view our world.
It is possible to make the argument that Thomas Jefferson is the first person to truly articulate a theory of race in the United States, and in effect he has to do so. He has said in the Declaration of Independence that we are all created equal. Well, if in fact we're all created equal, and if in fact we're entitled to our liberty, then how can he possibly own 175 slaves and going up to about 225 slaves at the peak of his slaveholding?
In notes, Jefferson's words appeared to justify slavery at a time when many were admonishing the Founding Fathers for espousing freedom, while continuing to support a system of human bondage.
The problem that they had to figure out is, how can we promote liberty, freedom, democracy on the one hand, and a system of slavery and exploitation of peoples who are non-white on the other?
And the way you do that is to say, yeah, but you know, there's something different about these people. This whole business of inalienable rights, that's fine, but it only applies to certain people.
The moment when we become a nation is critical for our understanding of both American nationality and race. We accept the notion that all men are created equal, but then perhaps some of those people who are enslaved are not quite men. That is, we'll keep our ideas of American nationality, but we'll write certain people out of the human family.
The suspicions of black racial inferiority raised by Jefferson had evolved over time, shaped in part by an intense need for labor in the American colonies. In 1619, when the first Africans arrived in Virginia, religion and wealth, not physical appearance, defined status. Blackness and whiteness were not yet clear categories of identity.
They were more likely to distinguish between Christians and heathens than they were between people of color and people who were white. They regarded a person's status in life as somehow more fundamental than what color they were or what their particular background was.
The court took up the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, a South Asian immigrant and U.S. Army veteran who petitioned for citizenship on the grounds that Indians were of the Aryan or Caucasian race, and therefore white.
And he makes the scientific argument that he is Caucasian. He gets scientific authority to speak on his behalf, that in fact South Asians are included in the Caucasian race.
So here the court was in a bind because they were presented with so-called scientific evidence that Indians were Caucasian. And the court solved this problem by saying that it didn't matter what science said, so-called science. They actually said white is not something that can be scientifically determined, but white is something that is subjectively understood by who they called the common person, the common man.
It may be true, reasoned the court, that the blonde Scandinavian and the brown Hindu have a common ancestor in the dim reaches of antiquity, but the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences between them today.
You'll notice all those judges are old white men. And back in these days, it was rich white men that owned property that could vote. They were the ones holding the power, legislating the values that people had to live by, like the value of human life.
The same court that used science to determine whiteness in Ozawa 3 months before now refuted its own reasoning in Thind. Thind might well be Caucasian, the High Court said, but he was not white. The justices never said what whiteness was, only what it wasn't. Their implied logic was a circular one. Whiteness was what the common white man said it was.
The court often decided who was white and who wasn't based on whether they just felt that the person would politically fit well into the kind of society that we were trying to build. And sometimes it was pretty explicit that this is what the court was doing.
Courts and legislators had long been in the business of conferring racial identities. In the South, to enforce Jim Crow segregation and laws against mixed marriages, courts had to first determine who was black under law.
And here's where it really gets interesting. You got some places, for example, Virginia law defined a black person as a person with 1/16 African ancestry. Now, Florida defined a black person as a person with 1/8 African ancestry. Now, Alabama said, you're black if you got any black ancestry, any African ancestry at all. But you know what this means? You can walk across a state line and literally, legally change race. Now, what does race mean under those circumstances? You give me the power, I can make you any race I want you to be, because it is a social, political construction.
At the turn of the 20th century, American society was riding a wave of confidence as an emerging industrial power. And the face of its power and prosperity was white. African Americans lived under the yoke of Jim Crow segregation. Most surviving Native Americans had been banished to reservations, and new immigrants crowded into urban ghettos. Disease was rampant. Death rates soared. Infant mortality was high. To many, This reflected a preordained natural order.
Those that looked wanted to confirm what they saw, which is to say that the proper place of, say, the Negro, or in other regions of the country, the Native American or the Chinese, were at the bottom of the social and political hierarchy. And if you can say that they are fundamentally biologically different, then they should be. Then it's natural for them to be at the bottom of our social hierarchy.
The biology becomes an excuse for social differences. The social differences become naturalized in biology. It's not that our institutions cause differences in infant mortality. It's that there really are biological differences between the races.
For Prudential life insurance statistician Frederick Hoffman, those differences could lead to only one fate for African Americans. In Vital Capacity, he wrote, "The tendency of the Negro race has been downward. This tendency must lead to a still greater mortality, and in the end, cause the extinction of the race." Hoffman's Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro was published in 1896, the same year the Supreme Court legalized segregation. It was one of the most influential publications of its day.
And today, the institutions that create this inequality, that create poverty and homelessness, that maintain low wages below a livable wage, are unexamined. We look at politicians and we look at Trump or Pelosi or whoever, but we forget to look at the structure that they're serving, the structure of values that has been maintained for all these centuries, values that do not support human life, but support the stratification of human life for exploitation, to bring power and wealth to a very select few.
What's interesting is that it resonated in the minds of so many other social observers of the time, the extinction thesis. It fit into their notions of how races become ascendant in the world. They looked at other groups of people in various stages beneath them as approaching the completely civilized state.
Hoffman presented his statistical data as unimpeachable science. He compared rates of death and disease between African Americans and whites, and, not surprisingly, found enormous disparities. But his data analysis was flawed. He ignored the insidious effects of poverty and social neglect on health. In contrast to today's belief in black physical superiority, Hoffman concluded that African Americans were innately infirm. As such, attempts to improve their housing, health, and education would be futile. Their extinction was inevitable, encoded in their blood.
In a few genes that control the colors of melanin in our skin, different alleles, different mutations occurred that were positively selected, so that many of us with very light skin lost the capacity to make dark melanin.
Dark melanin blocks out some ultraviolet light and is found where sunlight is intense. Lighter melanin is found where sunlight is less intense. Scientists debate why this is.
One hypothesis is that it happened because sunlight is essential to have adequate vitamin D. In northern latitudes with very little light during the winter, one needed every bit of light that one could capture in order to be able to have adequate active vitamin D. And children in particular would need to be able to absorb into their skin enough light to have vitamin D present to keep them healthy.